At the time of recording this, I'm 43 years old, and I've been playing jazz guitar since I was a teenager. But if I could go back in time and give advice to my younger self, there's a lot of things I'd say, because these things I'm about to share with you would have saved me from making a lot of dumb mistakes. Number 1, having a journey mindset. One problem I had was a constant obsession with wanting to be better, and that constant focus on improving took away the enjoyment of playing. It was only when I started thinking of music as a lifelong journey that I really learned to enjoy practicing and playing more. And after all, that's why we play, right? It's for fun. Now, the turning point came for me during a period when I was practicing many hours a day. It became a chore because I was putting so much pressure on myself. And of course, we all want to improve, but shifting my mindset from the destination to the journey completely changed how I approach practice, and I've never looked back since. In practice, I try and just enjoy it being in the moment. What I don't get done today, there's always tomorrow. Number 2, don't let self-confidence limit your potential, and play with others. I can think back to times early on when I turned down opportunities to jam or play gigs because of low self-confidence. I was worried about making a fool of myself, and I'm sure I would have progressed much faster if I'd taken those chances and learned from the inevitable mistakes. It's easy to fall into the trap of feeling like you're never ready. Don't let that happen. Playing with others is one of the most rewarding things about making music, and you can learn an incredible amount, so please don't let self-confidence get in the way of you doing that. Number 3, comparison with others is futile. When I first started playing locally, I'd naturally compare my playing to others and dwell on what they had that I perceived that I didn't. Now, I've never been a particularly fast player. I tend to play more melodically and use speed in bursts. And I actually prefer that style over players who cram in too many notes. But boy, back then, all I wanted to do was be able to blaze through solos and play as fast as I could. But no two players are the same, so these comparisons are just deeply unhelpful, and they can really kill your confidence. Yes, we do need to be aware of our weaknesses, but we also have strengths too, and it's really important to be aware of those. Now, I don't recall when I stopped comparing myself to others, but at some point it just stopped bothering me, and I feel much better for not wasting that mental energy. I've come to have confidence and an appreciation of my own playing based on what I perceive my strengths to be, and it's great that other people have got theirs, and that's fine. Number 4, be open-minded. My first inroad into jazz was via Django Reinhardt and what's called gypsy jazz. I've since transitioned away from that. I still love Django, but I prefer just classic 30s and 40s jazz over straight-ahead modern gypsy jazz, which to me just isn't that musical. Now, when I was very much into gypsy jazz, I was extremely narrow-minded about what I would listen to, what gigs I'd go to, and so on. At the time, anything that wasn't gypsy jazz felt like a waste of my time. And ironically, although Django was a gypsy, his music bears little resemblance to what modern gypsy jazz has become. It's very easy to become laser focused on one genre, one subgenre, but many jazz musicians take influences from unexpected places. For example, Django was heavily inspired by Claude Debussy and Ravel. Nowadays, I try and be much more open-minded and listen to many genres of music. Number 5, stop wasting time on gas. This one's inevitable, and it still gets me a couple times a year, and that is gear acquisition syndrome, aka gas. Now, I've owned around, I think, 45 guitars so far, maybe more. I dread to think how much time I've wasted searching, watching demos, and just thinking about gear. And oddly, that pre-buying research stage, it can almost be more enjoyable than actually owning the piece of gear. Now, I don't think I'll ever fully escape gas, but I do have periods where I consciously avoid looking at new gear. Sometimes I just stop and realise how much time I've wasted, and that usually snaps me out of it for a while. And unless you take the step to never use the internet, it's very hard to avoid. But over the last year, I have sold a lot of gear. I found deleting apps like eBay, Facebook and Reverb from my phone has massively helped too. And I've tried to shift to only buying things that will enhance either what I do here on YouTube and Patreon or at gigs on the stage. Otherwise, it's a want and not a need. Number 6, learn to fill time. Nothing exposes you more when playing with others than having bad time. While timing can be written down and counted, I believe it's best felt. And what I mean by that is feeling the pulse of the music as it moves along and being in sync with that, being at one with that. Once you strongly feel the pulse, it becomes much easier to play different rhythms against it. It will hopefully also help with trying to be more consistent with your timing, so not speeding up or slowing down. I can think back to many years ago in rehearsals, and I realised I just wasn't experiencing time in the same way my fellow musicians were. Despite understanding timing, I couldn't feel it, and I'd been taking rhythm for granted. After that, I very deliberately worked on that problem, and I took a very boring but very helpful book called Basic Rhythmic Training. Once I worked on rhythm through that book as an isolated skill, it improved my ability to feel time, create lines that work against a certain amount of time, and also read music more accurately. Number 7, learn from more experienced players. I've often heard that it's best to be the worst musician in the room, which seems like a strange piece of advice. And I think there are different ways to interpret that, but playing with much more experienced musicians is a fantastic way to learn. Now, I lucked out with this in that my first jazz gig that is, was with an incredible musician called Bob Wilbur. And usually whenever I play with more experienced musicians, my inexperience would be exposed, but hopefully in a supportive way, they'd steer me in the right direction. So don't be afraid of being the worst musician in the room. See it as an opportunity to learn from others' knowledge and wisdom and experience. Just make sure you ask the right questions and soak up everything you can. Most musicians love helping others. You will obviously encounter the odd one that is just a bit of an idiot and not particularly pleasant to work with, but maybe you shouldn't play with those kind of people. 8. Deep knowledge of the major scale is essential. Understanding chord extensions, Roman numeral analysis, or modes is impossible without a solid knowledge of the major scale. Now, I got into modes through a book before I really understood the major scale or harmonized scales. And looking back, no wonder I struggled with things like altered scales and the Lydian dominant when I didn't even know my major scales properly. So here's a simple formula. The major scale is built from the intervals tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Start that pattern from any note and you have a major scale. Next step, harmonize it in thirds, build triads, and then add the seventh to those triads, and then you've got the chords in that key. And every major scale does the same thing. Yes, the chords and notes change between keys, but the qualities stay the same, thanks to the tone-tone, semitone formula. E.g., it's always going to go major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished. If you have this foundation down in multiple keys, songs make sense more readily, melodies make sense, and chord melodies make sense. Everything is just easier if you get that essential thing down. I find here on YouTube a lot of lessons share shortcuts and magic tricks, but the teachers almost certainly have all of this major scale harmony under their belts. It just doesn't make for a very clickable video title. 9. Chord tones are easier to solo with than modes. Now, there are two main schools of thoughts when it comes to soloing. I initially got sucked into the route of modes, matching a different mode to each chord. Now, whilst that can work, and for some songs I still approach it that way, I find chord tones, so arpeggios, are much simpler and often lead to more melodic possibilities when soloing. The idea of having to know 10 modes to get through a tune is just seriously overly complex. And once I shifted to using chord tones, my improvising felt much smoother and it felt less like academic, if you like. Of course, in later styles of jazz, obviously modal jazz, modes become the go-to way for soloing. But even then, you often end up emphasizing chord tones, which takes you full circle back to arpeggios. So I don't think this question will ever be answered. Scales and arpeggios are very much a chicken and egg situation. 10. Listening is as important as playing. Now, when I used to teach guitar in schools, the first question I'd ask a student was, who do you listen to? And if they stared at me blankly with no response, my heart would sink when they couldn't name anyone. Sometimes their parents just liked the idea of them playing, or the student just fancied giving the instrument a go. Now, when it comes to learning jazz, there has to be a balance between practicing and listening. And for me, the listening should be at least equal to, or maybe even more than your practice time. But let's face it, it's easier to listen to jazz than it is to practice it in the sense of time. We can easily fit it into our day when exercising, driving, doing jobs around the house. Now, I think it's very easy to keep listening to the same artists and tracks, but listening is where we get inspired. It's where musical vocabulary rubs off on us and where we pick up ideas for arrangements or solos. If you're ever stuck for ideas when soloing, I often think the answers are almost certainly on the recordings. If I hit a brick wall with soloing over a tune, I will hit up a few versions and just see how other musicians have navigated it and see, oh, I might try what they've done there. Also, whenever my motivation dips, which is normal, listening always helps bring me back. 11. Unconscious competence is key to everything. Now, on my Patreon page, I often talk about unconscious competence. Now, it's a model that explains how we learn something deeply, because I think a lot of people struggle with their playing simply because they have only a surface level grasp of things. Like, think about the things you practice. How well do you actually know them? If you compare what you're learning with jazz compared to really basic guitar stuff like playing an E minor chord, have you taken things as far in terms of how deep that is seated. The model goes like this. There's 4 stages to it. You start at unconscious incompetence, which means you don't know what you're doing wrong. E.g., you're playing a melody incorrectly, but you don't realise it. You then hopefully move into conscious incompetence, which I think is where, a lot of our time will sit. And that's where you're aware that you're making mistakes. It takes us towards conscious competence. And then you can do it now correctly, but you're having to really think about it for it to work. And where we want to take things, unconscious competence, where you can do things without thinking. It's effortless. Now, what's the benefit about knowing this? Well, I think if you know you're moving through these stages, you can be more patient and kind for yourself and take a longer term view with your learning. You'll also be more likely to practice things thoroughly rather than just dabbling until the next shiny object comes along. And it's very much in step with it's the journey, not the destination. 12. Sight reading is worth working on. Now, piano is my second instrument, but when I had guitar lessons, neither of my 2 teachers ever showed me anything in notation. I get it, most guitar players are terrible readers, unless they went down the classical route or play another instrument. Even though I could read because of my piano playing, I still found sight reading for guitar, say the real book on a gig, challenging. At one point, I thought enough's enough, and I dedicated just 10 minutes each day to sight reading. And over time, I reached a level where I'm happy with my reading. It could be improved, but it's reached a point where I'm reasonably happy with it. Now, sure, there are still charts that if someone put in front of me that would make my heart sink, but I feel so much better for just addressing this area of my playing and understanding. And why is it important? Well, because when you're playing with other musicians, besides guitar players, being able to read music makes you far easier to work with. 13. You can't blag soloing over tricky chord changes. I'm sure a lot can relate to this, slowly dying on stage whilst playing a dreadful solo over challenging chord changes, wishing the bandstand would swallow us up. Well, the problem in this case is often simple. You either know the changes or you don't. If you don't have an ear for the changes in a tune, you won't be able to put together a decent solo. And I've heard it said that you should be able to isolate a soloist and you still know where they are in the form because of how their solo implies the form and the chord changes. That's simply impossible if you don't know the harmony deeply. That's why I started my series making the changes, because for me that is a key foundation of jazz improvisation. 14. Melodies are meant to be interpreted. When I first began playing standards, I played melodies very robotically, exactly as written. Now that's important in certain contexts like bebop heads or any time where you have to play in unison or harmony with another musician. But for the majority of the tunes, the melody is meant to be interpreted. And that's where melodic variation comes in. Melodic variation is where you take the melody, but you might change aspects of the phrasing, dynamics, expression, articulation, and rhythm. It's also an excellent way to start working on soloing. On a tune you're struggling with, you can simply play a variation of the melody as your solo. Personally, I wouldn't want to play a melody the same way day after day. So if you're playing Autumn Leaves in the same way you played it 2 or 3 years ago, you need to work on trying to vary it. And I learned how to interpret melodies by listening to how great players approach them and imitating what they did. But before you start varying things, you can't vary something you don't know. You do need to know the melody deeply, which brings us back to unconscious competence. 15. Chord changes are subject to change. Well, everything is. Just like melodies can be varied, so can chord changes. There are countless ways to slip in extra chords, simplify progressions, or add substitutions. And it can sometimes be hard to know what the basic changes of a song are. To be honest, this still bugs me to this day. There often isn't a definitive version of a song's changes, just different ways to approach it. Now, as long as the melody is supported, that's not a problem, but don't be surprised if you play with someone else and they have different changes than you. They're probably not wrong, just different. 16. Understanding the history of the genre is important. One thing that took me a while to appreciate is that understanding jazz harmony is much easier if you understand the history of the genre. It helps you see how the music and harmony evolved and put songs and performers into context. For example, it's a lot easier to understand bebop if you already know about the swing era, since bebop grew out of the swing era. If you haven't yet read up on jazz history, I highly recommend Ted Choya's The History of Jazz. It's not too long and gives a great overview of the musicians and how jazz developed into what it is today. 17. Half the battle is internalizing the sound of chord changes. One big wall I sometimes hit with a song is simply not being able to hear the next chord change. Now, there's a huge difference between following a lead sheet and really knowing the sound of the next chord before you play it. I know I've internalized a tune when I can hear the changes in my head without playing them. Try it now with Autumn Leaves. Can you imagine the sound of the chord changes? If not, it's well worth working on your ear. To do this, maybe play the first chord of Autumn Leaves and then see if you can imagine the sound of the second one and play it to check whether you're hearing it correctly. For me, it's about learning the collective sound of each chord and then how the individual notes connect between the chords. And, listening to many versions of the tune helps massively with this. 18, you don't have to play fast. We're not playing shred metal, so there's no requirement necessarily to play fast. And ask yourself this, which player would you rather listen to? Player A, who plays 16th notes non-stop and shreds through the whole solo, versus player B, who phrases, leaves space and uses speed sparingly for impact. It's of course subjective, but I know which one I prefer. While it's great to have fast technique in your toolkit, it's not essential. A melodic solo often speaks to the audience much more effectively than speed will. I do enjoy it when players burn through fast lines, but only when it's contrasted with more spacious, phrased playing. Because after a while, the speed becomes fatiguing to the ears. 19. Don't limit your learning to guitar players. When I first started playing jazz guitar, I only listened to jazz guitarists, and that was incredibly short-sighted of me. Once I dug into the influences, though, of my favourite guitarists, I realised that many of them took inspiration from horn players or pianists. Of course, it's important to listen to guitarists, but it would be crazy to miss out on what we could learn from other instrumentalists or vocalists for that matter. I've created a guide to jazz repertoire with an accompanying playlist, and if you'd like guidance on listening and learning the repertoire, check the link in the description. And it also happens to be currently on sale with over 50% off. 20. You have to know some songs even though you're not allowed to play them. This is a bit of an annoyance, but you need to know how to play Summertime, So What and Blue Bossa, but don't you dare call them at a jam session or a gig. And I was shocked last year when at a gig, a fantastic sax player suggested we open with So What. I was floored. It was literally the first time I've ever played it outside of the confines of my home. And it was a lot of fun. So while you absolutely have to know these songs, I don't know, some tunes are just too popular or considered too lowbrow to call on stage or at a jam session, and I just don't get it. Sure, a band can end up with a bland repertoire if they only play super popular tunes, but banning songs outright seems harsh to me. And it's just so stupid that despite, it not being cool to play them, you still need to know them. That's just, I can't see the logic myself. Well, I can guarantee though, if I go to tonight's gig and I say, let's play Summertime, I'm going to get shot down straight away. 21, hear harmony in larger blocks. When I first started learning songs, I'd learn them chord to chord. So like D minor 7 to G7 to C major 7. There's 3 separate chords. But the smart way to hear that and think about it is a simple block of harmony, and obviously in that case being a major 2, 5, 1. Thinking and hearing things in larger harmonic blocks makes learning and remembering tunes much easier. It will also help massively if you want to play longer phrases. 22, heavier strings don't always mean too much tension. The classic advice for jazz guitar is to use heavy strings. Many players swear by 13s or 14s. Now, when I first came into jazz, I was on my Epiphone Sheraton with, I'm guessing, 9s or 10s, and I couldn't imagine wrestling with heavier gauge strings at the time. Nowadays, I play Tomastic bebop strings in 12s or 13s. They give me that fat, singing tone on the top 2 strings without feeling like medieval torture devices, provided your guitar's set up properly. Sure, I wouldn't slap these on a Strat, but on an arch top or a thin line jazz box, they're perfect. 23, your previous learning can still help you play jazz. Jazz can feel very elusive, like nothing you've learnt previously to starting jazz is any use. But remember, a classical guitar player brings reading chops, hopefully, and dynamic control to learning jazz, huge strengths. Whereas like a blues player already you'd think would know how to improvise and feels comfortable maybe on stage as well, and again brings great strengths to learning jazz. Every style you've studied has given you some sort of insight into music and given you tools. And I'd suggest embracing your background, your unique blend of experience is what makes you the guitar player you are. 24, no matter what guitar you buy, you're still going to sound like you. I find this fascinating. I get new guitars, I swap guitars, I try someone else's guitars, and while maybe there's a tonal shift, my musical voice still shines through and it sounds like me. Now, what really matters for me with guitar is feel, playability, and how the instrument inspires me, and if I'm honest, looks too. Now, will buying a fancy guitar make us better guitar players? Probably not, but it might make you smile every time you pick it up. 25, record yourself to get reliable feedback. I used to cringe at the idea of gig recordings. Hearing my own playing back felt like hearing my own voice on tape. Most musicians listen to the mixes of when they've recorded an album once and never again. I know I'm like that, but recording your practice, or better, if you gig, recording your gig, is a good way to give ourselves feedback, because can we give ourselves reliable feedback in the moment? Probably not. You'll hear exactly what needs work, what you're doing well. It does take some getting used to, but it's one of the fastest ways to level up. Now this was 1 to 25, there's another 75 to come. There will be 3 more instalments of this series, one each month. Much of what I discuss here is covered in my Patreon lessons, so please do check the link in the description. And remember, the biggest hurdle for many guitarists is learning to play the changes so their improvisation actually fits the harmony. I always say, learn to play inside before you play outside. My Making the Changes series tackles that head on, and you'll see it on the screen now. Thanks so much for watching. If these tips helped, then hit the like button, and also why not drop a comment with your own jazz learning struggles or victories. Please subscribe for more jazz guitar lessons every Monday. Until next time, you take care.